Good evening. My name is Renee LaBelle. I'm your host tonight for the symposium. Well, actually, I misnamed that. It's the Project Management Speaker Forum. I'm having a problem. We got symposium coming up in May, so I'm getting confused with our new symposium moving to May. Anyway, we have somebody left the fridge door open today. My God, it's so bloody cold out there. I can't believe it. Anyways, I want to welcome all of you tonight. Is there anyone here for the first time? Oh, fantastic. Well, welcome. How'd you hear about us?
The breakfast seminar at Plano on Saturday.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, welcome. So the way I remember to be here on Tuesday is third Tuesday of the odd month. And we've been running this for, gosh, many more than 10 years. And we probably got about 8 years of these are recorded, so it's a really easy way for you to get PDUs, as you saw on the screen over here to my left and to my right. Anyway, I wanted to introduce our speaker tonight. Joe Carson is our president of the Dallas PMI chapter, and he's going to give us a presentation on leadership, which looks really super interesting. It's one of my favorite topics. And he's a native of South Carolina. This is his, I guess, second time in Dallas area. He's had a lot of manufacturing background, chemical, textiles, carpet in South Carolina. And he's working on his dissertation and hopes to be finished this year from the University of Dallas. So please welcome Joe Carson.
Yep. Yep. Can you all hear me okay? All right. Thank you very much, Renee, for the introduction. Hopefully you all did catch the topic of tonight's discussion. We are going to talk about leadership. We're going to have an interactive session. We've got a couple things in here I'm trying out for the first time, a webinar, if you will, not necessarily a webinar, but a poll anywhere component within our session. So I want you to make sure you get your phones out, and we'll be looking at some of your responses and things of that nature to kind of see what pops up on the screen to some of the questions. Obviously, to Renee's point, it's pretty cold outside, so I really do appreciate all of you coming out tonight. I understand it's not a warm drive to get here, and it wasn't a warm walk in, so I do appreciate you coming out. And then once again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak for this forum. It's a pleasure on my behalf, especially newly into the seat of the president for the PMI Dallas chapter. I see a lot of our members here, so we really do appreciate you all keeping this going for the last 12 years, right? Because it's an opportunity for us to interface with UT Dallas and also getting our members out in the community and doing other things of that nature. So we really do appreciate that opportunity of coming out tonight. And without further ado, we'll get into this interesting topic. So I hope you don't worry about taking too many notes. If you want to take notes, then that's fine. But if you want a copy of the slide, I'll give you a card and just send me or give me your card and we can share information. And I'll give you a PDF of the slide deck. I don't have any problem doing that. And what we'll actually do is I'll give you a PDF of the slide deck with the data that hopefully comes in from our surveys that we'll have throughout the session, so you can kind of see some components. Selecting the correct leadership style for your project situation. Emphasis that I want to have tonight is on improving the project manager's leverage, okay? So here's our agenda that we want to discuss. Obviously, we need to discuss what is leadership. We need to review a few leadership styles. We should all know kind of what a project is, but we're going to touch on that from a project management perspective to make sure we're all on the same page before we move over to the next attributes in the next session that we really need to discuss. Then we're going to also figure out how does it apply to the correct, how do I select the correct leadership style based on the situation for your project phase. So it's going to be an interesting session if we communicate back and forth. I know we're in a larger room, but I'm one of those people who, you talk back to me, I will make it move a little bit faster. It'll become a lot more interesting. We'll move and we'll get a lot more out of the session. I got enough content to stand up here and kind of lecture you for an hour and a half if we want to go that path, but I think it would behoove all of us so you don't fall asleep and, there's no pizza tonight. Sorry about that. But you can, if we stay involved and get involved into the presentation, you get a lot more impact to you. You can share some of your thoughts. We're all professionals in the room, and we can trade those ideas and thoughts and make sure that we're learning together. What are the expected results if I choose the correct leadership style for the project situation? So let's get into this topic. We've discussed what we're going to talk about. And just before we get into it, let's do a little bit of an icebreaker. All right. How many people in the room, obviously, I know I've seen a lot of familiar faces. How many people in the room, this is your first time meeting me? Okay. Did I say hello or good evening to everyone when you walked into the room? I attempted to. I might have been talking and having some other conversations or standing up here, but if I didn't, I want to make sure I say good evening to you. And you'll understand this as we go throughout the presentation, right? I'm putting some subliminal messages out there so that you can kind of pick up on some of the attributes that you might want to emulate, right? So that you can see the good leadership as it is in front of you, standing not only through the presentation, but also an example of what those leadership styles are. So for us to really understand what leadership is, we need to look at the word, all right? If you look at the word leadership, it actually breaks down into two components, leader and ship. It's not anything new, it's not anything rocket science. We all know that the word leader is actually the personification for lead, the verb lead, right? So what we're wanting to really to do is to break up these two words to understand what's the true root cause and the root understanding of what leadership is, okay? I know you can go there. I looked today. There are 3.2 million hits on Google Scholar if you go pull up the word leadership. 3.2 million people have written some article, have written some doctorate, dissertation, some thesis, something about leadership. However, we're not going to focus on the 3.2 million. We want to understand what is the magnitude of that, right? What does the word leadership mean? And then how we can apply it to our projects, right? Emphasis on the project and the implication and application of leadership to that particular project. So obviously I said the word leader is the personification of the verb lead or to lead. And ship sounds like we're heading on a journey. So ships ahoy, let's get on, right? Let's go ahead and pull out a port and let's get started. So what I actually did is I went to Webster, and I want to pull out both definitions of the word leadership. I pulled out the full definition of the word leadership, so you don't have to try to worry about memorizing all these components and everything associated with it. We're going to only touch on a couple of these topics, but I wanted to share it with you so that you can, if you take the interest to go in and look at it, you'll see how the actual verb has a transit and an in-transit meaning associated with it, okay? So obviously to guide, a way of specializing by going in advance, right? So you're moving in front of them, you're preceding them, to direct on course or give a direction, to serve as a channel for, to go through, right? Let's put a little star, if you will, or consider for a moment to go through and put it in the sense of a project. If you consider that aspect of lead, to go through, right? To direct the operations, activities, or performance of, to have charge of, to suggest, on and on and on. And I'm not going to read this to you because obviously we could be here for another 20 minutes with me reading this definition to you and talking about what the potential outcomes and things are associated with that. But I think we all know what the word to lead means, right? We all have our sense of what does it mean to lead. And we all have our perception of what leadership is. And we all have our perception of what a good leader is as well. We have our perception of what a bad leader is, okay? We're going to touch on a little bit of those components in a little while. I'm going to get some of those perceptions out of you. Ask for you to share your perception with me, per se, so that we can kind of see and talk in a little bit more detail around some of those aspects. So I really want to key in on a couple things that we're going to discuss tonight. Here's the rest of that definition. Here's the in-transit verb component of that definition. It's to be first, right? The state leads in population, being open to tend toward or to have a result, to direct the first of a series, right, of blows on the opponent if you're in boxing, things of that nature. So very elaborate, the word, even though it's only 4 letters, lead. Okay? Consider that. Now let's take a look at what ship means. We're not talking about a physical ship as in a noun, right? We're talking about to ship something, not to ship it as in give it to FedEx, UPS, or any of those major carriers, or USPS, right? But we're talking about to embark upon a journey, right? So if I lead you, I'm at the front, and then I'm embarking upon a journey. So if I am in a leadership role, I should be, depending on your version and your style of leadership, I should be in front of you, taking you on a journey, right? Now consider your project. If you are the project manager, you are on the leadership team, right? That's the term we often use. The leadership team for your project management personnel, if you're a part of that group, you want to lead them down the path of completing that project. For what reason? Well, it's simple. You want to lead them down that path because, number one, you've already got some scope requirements that your client has agreed to, right? You've already got some contractual obligations, possibly, depending on what the project is. If you're in the world of EPC, engineer, procurement, construction, you may have large contractual obligations associated with it. You may also have some risks associated with those aspects. So one thing that we should really consider is, even though we're taking them on a journey, we need to understand how we can better impact our project specifically by maybe looking internal to ourselves, right? Maybe our best exposition, if you will, on the project is to look internal to what we can do ourselves and how we impact that project, how we can enhance the project by looking internal. Have you ever thought of it that way? Anyone in the room? Have you ever considered, maybe if I change my approach to the way that I'm handling the staff, the personnel, what have you, for the project, maybe my outcome may slightly be different, right? So I really want to ask you to open your minds to think about what if this gave me some results that it would not give me normally, if I just thought about these different styles that we're going to review of leadership and how I can interface differently with my project teams and how I might positively impact the outcome of my project. Big to consider, right? I was just talking to the gentleman a few minutes ago. One of the last projects that I did in the engineering, procurement, construction industry was a $1.2 billion facility, right? $1.2 billion facility. My responsibility, when you look at projects and when they're that large, you do have a project director, right? But they have a lot of people that work underneath them that manage a lot of those other scope components and smaller pieces of the project. My responsibility was to handle all of the schedule associated with that project. I was the planning person, okay? Planning, scheduling. Well, if you've ever been on a project site in construction, you understand that is one of the harder aspects to really manage, because you have to make sure all your materials are there. You have to make sure that everyone has all the parts, not just the parts, the exact parts that they need so that they can install them at the time that they're estimated to install them. Because if they don't, then I could potentially delay the schedule, right? For example, if I need to install, let's say I've got a pump, piping, and it's going to another piece of equipment, okay? Well, I can start on certain ends, the piping, but I have to finish it at some point. I can't just leave the piping open, right? It's got a dead end, if you will, inside of both pieces of the equipment because the pipe is actually known to carry some substance. Substance may be steam, substance may be material, as in a liquid. It may be what have you, depending on what you're building. It could be slightly different. Let's consider your home. Everyone has a home or you live in some established location, right? So it's cold enough outside that you might want to consider this aspect when it's freezing. And I want you to think about what potential leadership discussions that we could have associated with this project. Let's say that I am the owner of a facility and I reside in, we'll say Arizona, okay? I reside in Arizona and we typically don't have cold winters, theoretically, right? I know that's not necessarily the truth, but theoretically, let's say we typically don't have cold winters. We have very hot summers. So I have piping that's, let's call it 3 inches and smaller, okay, on my job site. Some of it has water. Well, I have a very cold winter all of a sudden. And I have no way of ensuring that this piping, which has to be there, because it has to cool down this, let's call it a reactor, right? So now we're looking very close to something that if you really consider Japan, right? How they actually had, when the tsunami came in, they had the loss of the power in their power facilities and things of that nature, okay? So you have to have water in this pipe to cool down this reactor. But because of something outside of my control, I had to shut down the plant for an immediate stop, okay? So I have to turn off the water. So now I have water sitting in the 3-inch line, and it is not insulated. And it gets cold outside. What happens? It bursts. I can't start that plant back up without the water, right? Now you can say, well, that was really an engineer's fault. Possibly. But I can tell you someone signed off on it, not just that engineer, okay? Whether we want to agree to that or not, the truth is someone signed off on it, not just that engineer. So what happens in that situation? I've got a reactor that has to be fed with water in order for me to start the plant up, okay? Let's say this plant was a power plant. Let's say it was a power plant in Texas. Let's say it happened in reality. What do we do? Because it did. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I'm telling you that it did happen, okay? You all remember the rolling blackouts from, 6 years ago? You remember that? That's how they started. Something along those lines. It wasn't exactly a broken water pipe. It was some other features that happened. But it was because the lines were not heat traced. So what you have to do is when you have a substance going through a pipe that's smaller than 4 inches, you have to heat trace the pipe. So that if your temperature drops below freezing, the substance doesn't freeze and burst the line. It only comes on when it's 40 degrees outside, right? Because you don't want it on in the middle of the summertime. There's no point in trying to heat it at that point. But the problem is, if you don't have those fail-safes in place, what happens? What's your leadership at that point when you're creating blackouts, rolling blackouts potentially, for customers? Because there's a demand on the grid, but there is no power, right? There's no way for me to put the substance that I'm generating back onto the grid, right? So the way grid systems actually work is you have a demand and you have a supply. They have to equal each other. If they don't, you got a blackout. Somebody's asking for power and you don't have enough power to get to them. Okay? That's very simplistically how they work, right? I'm not going to the engineering components associated with that. But my point to you is, what happens? What happens to that leadership of that company? What happens to the leadership of that project team? How do they feel? Stressed out, yeah, very much so, especially if they're trying to start that plan up, right? If they're trying to meet the deadline of that project. So I know we often see smaller aspects such as project management, such as leadership within project management to be a smaller aspect, and we think, oh, well, it's a feel-good measure. Well, some may consider it a feel-good measure. But I can tell you it also has some direct impacts sometimes associated with your project. For example, consider this moment. Let's say we'll stick with the cold thing. Let's say there was and I'm not saying this happened, okay? This is not a realistic, a real example, not a real world example. It is a realistic example. Let's say we had a junior project manager that actually told that project team, hey, my whole responsibility for this project was to ensure that we had a subcontractor to install all of the heat trace on the piping, right? I know you were eager to get that project implemented and started and up and going. But we cut our schedule, we crashed our schedule by saying the likelihood of this is very low, right? We have all those techniques, trust me, I've used them often to crash schedules and to figure out ways and take on the associated known risks, right? And oh yes, we'll come back and implement it before it gets cold outside, right? Before it gets cold outside, sometime never comes around, especially in the state of Texas. We might have cold weather, 5-10 days a year on average, right? So when you come to speak of it from that perspective, this is very unusual for us to have weeks of cold weather. In that particular situation, it was an unusual year, right? But what happens to the leadership of that team? Do they trust that leader? Do they not trust that leader? How do they feel? What's their motivation? Or do we say, it's not even about leadership, it's somebody failed to do their job? Why did they fail to do their job? Right? What does it go back to? I would suggest to you that it all turns back to the leadership of your personnel. Here's the reason why. Because if I take a stance that we're going to do exactly what the scope of our requirements say, even though we may find other ways of crashing our schedule, we may find other ways of doing and implementing things faster, but we're going to meet what our requirements of our schedule are, or our scope, right? And we're going to make sure that we meet our schedule time frame. But we're going to find ways to manage it, all right? Question is, one might say, is it ethical? Well, possibly, depending on the way you want to view it. One might say, is it something that really could be controlled by the individual? Well, you tell me. What's your thoughts, right? So those are all potential scenarios that we can look at. And you've probably heard me talk a little bit about and mention the word leadership styles, right? How many of you know of some leadership styles? Scream it out to me. Some of them are lead by example, okay? I saw another hand go up. What was it? Oh. Autocratic. Autocratic is a leadership style. There you go. Servant leadership. Leadership and knowledge, yes. There are many leadership styles out there. If I had to estimate, I would say that there are probably at least that I know of, there's about 25 that I know of. We're not going to cover 25 tonight. We're going to talk about 8, okay? Because this session would be extremely long if I was to give you a little detail about each one of those 25 leadership topics. And then what actually happens is you get into leadership style, and then you get into some of the other attributes that affect leadership style. And some of those are slightly the same, but they're different in slight ways as well. So some of the leadership styles are very similar, and then some of them are drastically different. Okay, I'm trying to cover some of the well-known ones that are out there today. So Webster defines leadership as this: the office or the position of a leader, the capacity to lead, the act or an instance of leading. My question to you is, what do you think leadership is? Not everybody speaking at once. Yes?
I think it's kind of having a concept on what's the end of the tunnel, and then making sure your people make it through to the end of the tunnel so that you reach the other end.
That's a
Whatever that takes.
It's a great way of saying it. To have a concept of what the end of the tunnel is, and that they make it to the opposite end of that tunnel, right? Excellent point. Yes?
Have people follow your...
To have people follow your leader. Okay? Anyone else? All right. Let's talk leadership. We've talked about the definition of the word. Let's get into a little bit more of the details associated with leadership. But to do that, we must first do a historical evaluation of leadership, right? Now, I'm going to put a slide up here. It's going to be hard for a lot of you to read. We're going to blow it up and look at certain parts of it, okay? You all may be able to see this. The screen is pretty good, actually. I'm going to tell you what it says. The study of history was the initial study of leadership. And this was actually before 400 BC, right? So leadership is not a new phenomenon. Regardless of how many times we want to think, oh, yes, we found something new, it's not. So what actually happened in before 400 BC is historians would look at rulers or people in authority, and they would describe them. It was that description that really they were talking about was their leadership style, right? Here's what happened. Here's what they did. Here's the issue that they faced. Here's how they overcame it. So, before 400 BC, not new. The actual beginning of the scientific study of leadership was in the 1900s. Okay? Leadership is broken up into these schools that you see here. There's a trait school, behavioral school, contingency school, the contextual school, the relational school, the skeptics, those that say, is there really a such thing as leadership? Right? And then we had the information processing. We had new leadership, which is from the 1980s until now. Then we get into biological and evolutionary leadership. Let's talk a little bit about these components. So I'm not going to go into detail about these schools, but does this resonate with anyone? The schools of leadership? Okay. So there's a book by Benjamin M. Bass. It's around 1,500 pages, okay? And he talks, this is the 4th edition of the book, okay? That just came out 2008, I believe. It's that edition of that book. And they actually break down these schools. I'm not going to get into detail about each one of the schools. I really want to focus tonight on the leadership styles and then getting some interaction so that we all can see what those leadership styles are. Obviously, you can understand some of these, the contingency schools, the trait schools, the behavior schools. The word's somewhat self-explanatory as to what that school of thought was really around that subject and around the processes that they were looking at. I can tell you they're not going away. A lot of things that were in the trade school, you'll still see some of those types of leadership today. Autocratic leadership was one of those that was in the trade school, right? So it still exists today. So yes, there's a lot of history associated with it. I really wanted to throw this deck up, or this slide on this particular deck, so that you can kind of see it's not new, right? This topic, while it may be germane to some of us, is not a new one. And the reason why it may be germane to some of us is because depending on where you are in your career, some of you may be getting training in the leadership, and you say, oh, well, this is just another one of those leadership trainings. Yeah. The problem is a lot of people don't understand how those leadership trainings actually and what they're intended to do, right? They go into the leadership training and they say, yes, this is what, I'm going to sit in this hour training. I'm going to pick up my PDUs that I have to do for work. This is a requirement. Everybody has to take it, so I'm just going to go ahead and take it. And you sit through the training because it is a requirement, and you say, okay, yeah, got it done. Box check, moving on, right? But you never really consider using those tools to improve what you do potentially in your day-to-day job. How many people have sat in those trainings before? How many people have used those skills after sitting in those trainings? Oh, it's a few hands in the room. Okay. So, good. Some of you have actually picked up on the tidbits of information that are out there that are actually very good examples of leadership. Here's a couple common styles of leadership. I told you we're not going to discuss the plus 25. We're only going to talk about the 8. And I'm going to go into detail around these particular styles of leadership. So we'll discuss them in a little bit more detail. You ask her, how does she know autocratic was on the slide?
Said she had the first one.
Yeah, she did. I promise I didn't slow her the deck before the class or anything like that, right? Well, I promise you, she did not see my deck pop up on the screen. I'm just kidding. Everybody okay? We're doing okay. We're good on time. Everyone okay? Everybody still awake? This means yes, this means no, or this means no, depending on if you're asleep or not. Okay, so common leadership styles. We're going to jump right into the autocratic leadership. Autocratic leadership is an individual who has control over all decisions, takes little input from a group, and the decisions are typically made based on their own judgments and inputs, right? They don't really care what others think. They hear them, and they proceed, all right? Now, some of you may be looking at this saying, why is he using verywell.com? I actually use sources that when you get this deck, it break it down in a lot more detail, but they're not necessarily the academic sources. They're more practical sources, things that can help you in your day-to-day project management skills. When you go in and click on it, it's not going to be an academic thesis based on what someone is comparing in their dissertation or their thesis, right? It's not going to be that. While I could provide that to you, I want to make sure I provide something that's applicable so that you can take it and gain the knowledge associated with it at the conclusion of our session, if you so choose to take these slides. If not, hopefully you gain all the content in the session and you can take it back and apply it in your day-to-day operations. So, autocratic leadership. Anyone hear that term before tonight? Yeah. That one's been around for quite some time, and it's a very common term, and it's a common style. I'm not going to ask if you use that style or not. I don't want to call any of that stuff out now. We'll get to our survey, and we'll take a look at some of that. I don't want anyone to stand up and say, well, that's me. That's all I ever do. Don't want you to do that. There are some positives and negatives to every leadership style, okay? Know that up front. Every one of these 8 leadership styles has a positive and a negative associated with it. Okay? So, but at least a lot of you are familiar with autocratic leadership. Little input from a group, and they make all the decisions. Yes, sir.
The previous slide, where you've shown those leaderships,
Mhm.
I don't think they are mutually exclusive. The same person, today morning could be autocratic, and the evening something else. It depends on the situation.
Interesting.
Depends on the situation, on the people you have working for you in the different projects that you have.
Agree. So what you're saying is, even though we show, let's go back to the slide. Even though we show these as 8 distinct attributes or leadership styles, they're not mutually exclusive. Right? I agree with that statement. And then you came along and said, it depends on the situation and what you're facing. Man, you all are advanced. I can just sit down and we can go home for the rest of the evening. But we're going to discuss that a little bit more, right? Are there others in the room that have that same thought process, or is there anyone that opposes that, just stand on the opposite of the fence and say, I don't think so? Yes.
I've been told that the servant leadership cannot be it's actually the antithesis.
It is the antithesis of servant leadership, right? They're opposite ends of the spectrum, all right? I don't disagree with that. But to say that you can't intertwine them, it depends. Let me ask you a question. You're in the hospital. Let's not say you. Let's say you know someone who's in the hospital, right? You're a proponent of servant leadership. They need to have an operation. Are you going to use servant leadership, or are you going to use an autocratic leadership style? Are you going to say, hey, I'll take the situation in control? Or do you want the doctor, better yet, let's say the doctor. Do you want the doctor to use an autocratic leadership style? Or do you want them to use a servant leadership style?
Strictly a democratic, needs to be a little quite on the
Okay, I can agree with that, right? Yes.
I think it's flipping different leadership styles, not just, you can be all of them in the same day even. My 13-year-old, I'm definitely autocratic in the morning, get him out of the house. When I get to the office, if I'm coaching a Little League, I'm charismatic, right? I'm trying to inspire there. If I'm facilitating a team, I'm gone into servant leadership. So I think I'm flipping through these. At night it may be laissez-faire. Whatever happens, happens. I'm
Yeah.
gonna let it roll.
Yeah.
I'm too tired to care about it at this point. So I think it's a matter of flipping through them. As long as you understand what the characteristics are, it's a matter of analyzing who and what's in front of you and then deciding which one you're going to pop on.
And I totally agree with different hats, different projects, different audiences. But typically, if you're on a team and you're processing servant leadership, throw a autocratic in there, which is deval your team.
But it depends on the situation. I mean, that's what you're talking about, right? I mean, it depends on the situation you're in. How critical is it?
Right.
Is there safety involved? Is there human life involved? I mean, there's a lot of other things that are involved.
So let me give you another example. And you'll like this one, right? It's another engineering procurement example. Reason why is I spent 8 years in that industry. I've got plenty of examples that I can use across the board that will touch every industry that you may want to go down the path of, right? Because they touch all those different industries. And I'm going to use an example. Let's communications, which is what you work in, right? All right. So, how many people have some way of communicating with others that are not in their home while they're there? In other words, you have some telecommunication aspect, right? Let me ask you a question. When you pick up the phone, you expect to hear what?
No answer, goes to voicemail, then you text them and they answer.
Hello?
Wow, sounds just like me. And hello, right? Someone to respond on the other end of the situation, right? So let's look at this. Let's look at it from autocratic, right? It's in your control. You pick up the telephone. When I say the telephone, I mean, the older versions. If I had a flip phone, I would pop it open for you. So you pick up the phone, right? But if you're using a landline, you expect to hear a dial tone first, right? It's common. You expect to hear the dial tone, then some numbers start to generate, even if you key them in first before you hit the talk button or the send button or what have you. That's exactly what you expect to hear. Let's say you're expecting that, but the person on the other end of the phone, he is a believer of servant leadership. And he's more concerned about making sure the others around him are getting served instead of giving you the service in which you're asking and requesting for. Which leadership style are you going to apply in that particular situation? So the individual on the opposite end of the spectrum, or we can go back to I guess it was probably 1930s, 1940s, where you had switchboard operators, right? I'm not old enough to know that. I'm just going down the historical path because I understand how it worked. But you had switchboard operators. That switchboard operator's responsibility was to pick up the phone on this end and say, oh, I'm trying to connect to Boston, right? He's supposed to patch you to another connection that's going to get you somewhat close to Boston. Actually, to a connection, to a connection, to a connection that gets you close to Boston, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. That's the thesis or behind, the premise behind, shall I say, the concept. Well, let's say that individual was, and I'm not knocking servant leadership at all, okay? I'm not knocking any leadership style when I say this. I'm just giving you an example. Let's say that individual, he believed in servant leadership and he was helping others. So I'm hanging on my end of the phone, waiting on the dispatcher, right, to make the connection. What leadership style am I more than likely going to use if I don't get that connection? You're going to be very autocratic, right? So even though they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, I guess what I'm saying to you is it depends on the situation at hand, right? Even though they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. For instance, I'll give you another real world, not really a real world, I'll give you another realistic example. More recent, right? Someone has to sign a contract. That contract's going to be a magnitude of $1 billion agreement, okay, between two firms. Someone's going to be held responsible for that contract. There has to be one name on the bottom of that contract, or two, depending on how your company's set up, right? So who is the company the board of directors are going to hold responsible for that contract? Including the project manager. Obviously, we're going to be held responsible for it, right? Even though our name may not even be on the dotted line, it may be some other executive. They're expecting that as your daily routine and your daily requirements to execute that contract, right? So I guess what I suggest to you is it depends, even in some servant leadership locations. Trust me, there are some great companies that hone in specifically on servant leadership. There's one local. Anybody ever heard of, anyone in here works for TDI Industries? TD Industries. You do? Anyone? They're a servant leadership company. They're here based in Dallas, right? That's the premise of how they operate their whole entire organization, okay? Servant leadership, I kid you not. From the senior executive all the way down to every individual in the company, the guy working in the mail, guy or lady working in the mailroom. Okay? That's their philosophy. If you look in academic studies and scholarly papers, you will see they actually use them as an example of servant leadership and how it actually works and how it can become positives for company. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that either or is necessarily good or bad. I'm just suggesting that it depends on the particulars of the situation, okay? Let's dig into democratic leadership.
Comment.
Yes.
I think it's important to realize that we're talking about leadership styles, not leaders. We're not saying we want to be autocratic leaders. There are times we will need to use an autocratic leadership style.
Correct. I agree with you. So
Because people have a real hesitancy to ever say autocratic is good.
yeah.
That's the new world says it's bad. I grew up in a time that it worked.
Yeah.
Not to say it's good.
Yeah,
There
well,
are times when you need to use different styles. Sometimes it's important not to use the autocratic leadership style.
correct. For an example, in the manufacturing age, right? When you were bringing over all this machinery and you were trying to set up all these facilities and locations, you needed one person who knew what they were doing. And they needed to give some dictation to tell someone, you need to have this done, you need to have A fix, B in place so that we can move on to the next process, right? So you're right. I'm not suggesting that autocratic leadership style is a thing of the past, because I don't think that way, okay? And I'm not suggesting that autocratic leaders is necessarily a negative or a positive individual. I'm suggesting that it behooves all of us as good project managers to probably touch at least the 8 of these leadership styles. Is actually what I'm suggesting to you. But let's keep going through them so that we can talk a little bit more about the leadership styles. And for those who are not familiar with them, you may want to become familiar with them, so I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on each one of these. Democratic leadership. Obviously, this one's probably the most obvious, especially as we stand and sit in the states, right, in the United States. We're a democratic organization, so we kind of understand how that works, right? It's a style of leadership in which the participants take part in the decision making, right? That's our democratic society at its best. It's essentially the same thing, if you look at it from that perspective. What you're saying is the people, right, involved actually are informed, and then they make those decisions, right? That one, hopefully that one's not, new to anyone, but if it is, that's fine too. You learned something about democratic process tonight. Didn't know that I was going to be a poli-sci individual in the room. I'm just kidding, guys. Yes.
There's been lots of studies that say this is the most effective for hospitals.
This is the most effective for hospitals? Interesting. And I know at least one person in the room who else in the healthcare industry? Healthcare.
Baylor has this on their boards everywhere.
Yep. I know at least one other individual that's in the room, actually is my wife. She's a nursing professor, so she teaches, one of her classes is leadership, and she teaches this to her students. So you're right. This is one of those democratic leadership style in that particular situation is actually probably best, because you don't want to rely solely on the basis of one's judgment, right? You want to have others provide their input. Especially if, to my point that I gave earlier, if you happen to have this dire operation and you're wanting that surgeon to actually come in and give you some feedback and tell you what's going on, those type of things. You want to have the ability to call in a second person to give you their opinion, right? To say, hey, yes, no, you don't need this, you need that. So I agree with that statement. So it does make sense that a lot of hospitals are using a democratic style of leadership. Any questions on this? The idea of the democratic style of leadership is group equality and the free flowing of ideas, right? Yes?
I agree with these ideas that the more the industry is towards the knowledge economy, like healthcare, IT, you tend to see democratic leadership more and more. When compared to, let's say, hierarchical kind of organization, it could be the whole manufacturing thing,
Yep.
or military, or any other thing.
Yep.
So I think it goes back to the education and the type of organization.
Yes, I agree with you. So make sure everyone can hear. So what he's saying is, as you move towards organizations that have become, I'm going to use the term innovative, more innovative, that are technology prone and things of that nature, you want to have more group thought, right, which is the free flowing of ideas, and you want others to contribute to that information so that you can move the organization forward in leaps and bounds, hopefully above your competition, which is the idea of actually doing that, right, which is the idea of sharing information with others, so that everyone's sharing that information, and someone may say, hey, this may be a better mousetrap. Might consider doing the programming this way versus that way, because you can get the same expected outcome, and it may take you less time, right, depending on what you're looking at. All right, laissez-faire. Who's heard of laissez-faire? How many people remember laissez-faire? I'm just going to not put a definition up. Clue, tell me what's the definition. I'm just kidding. I won't do that to you.
Let it be.
Huh?
French, let it be.
Yeah, exactly. You used it earlier. Let it be, right? It is what it is. And it happens. Per se, and it's that delegation. It's the handing off. The more, I should say, the more common use of that term is not only let it be, but it's the handing off. It's the delegation. I delegate my authority to X, and they do as they need to, right? The group makes a decision. I've delegated my authority, my responsibilities of making that call. So it is that. It's placing the emphasis on handing over the power to the followers to make a decision via delegation. Or, as you said, it is what it is, let it ride. Transactional leadership. People familiar with that one? Okay.
Awards and penalties.
Awards and penalties. You're right. So this was actually unique. The reason why I say this is unique is because this occurred in the 1980s, right? 1970s, 1980s, if you look at, depending upon the authors in which you look at and how you view the historical references is when they actually came up with this methodology and leadership style. It is a managerial process, right? And what the managerial process is, I'm interested in a task being completed. In order for me to complete that task, I must either give an individual an award or a penalty for not completing that task, right? Rewards are a consequence, right? Positive and a negative, to ensure that it is completed. That's what this transactional leadership style is. You see this sometimes a lot in the corporations, and we often see it a lot in project management. Let's be honest with ourselves. We do it all the time, right? Especially with subcontractors and things of that nature. We do it all the time. I need you to complete this project 5 days prior to the date that you gave me on your schedule 6 months ago. In order for you to do that, does that sound like an instance that you must have been talking about earlier? In order for me to do that, I'm going to give you $100,000. That part never happens. It's just the cramming down of the schedule and no reward, huh? It's just a consequence. You're going to miss the deadline. That also happens also in typical contracts. When I was doing that, I try to make sure it was some positive and some negative to it, right? It's a little bit more easier to absorb, if you will, if there's some positive associated with it. It's harder if there's only a negative. But transactional leadership actually says that it needs to be a positive, a reward, and a consequence, or punishment is the term that they actually use for, let's say, missing that particular item. And that's the way that they actually motivate their followers, right? You get so many widgets done from a manufacturing environment, right? 10 widgets done, you get paid on widget count. That's what it is. That's transactional leadership style, okay? So around the same time, you start to look at transformational leadership. How many have heard of transformational leadership? A few people are nodding their heads, yes, you've heard of it. Okay? Here's what transformational leadership says. Transformational leadership is a leadership style where the leader inspires followers to create a positive change while working in tandem with the participants, placing emphasis on developing the followers into leaders while working in tandem to complete the task. Right? So this is one of those examples of not only do as I say, but do as I do. Me showing you an example of do as I do means that you're going to learn leadership and transition and grow faster because I'm saying it to you and then I'm giving you an example. I'm saying it to you and then I'm giving you an example, right? That's what this leadership style is all about. There are a lot of corporations that are starting to do this. right? They're starting to do this now.
You really have to have the people who want it,
That is correct.
because I can't tell you how many people I've had that use all that, it's like they don't ever move forward.
This is correct. Some people are absolutely transactional leadership personnel, right? They get paid for the widgets. They're fine for getting paid for the widgets. They come in, they do their job, they get their pay for the widgets, and they go home, all right? They're not interested in transitioning to higher heights within the company, right? They're wanting the money, right? I mean, look, we all, if I told you you were no longer getting a check for your job, you probably would say, I'm no longer going, right? Let's be honest. Let's not sugarcoat this. If I told you you were no longer getting a check for your job, you probably say, well, I'm not coming in tomorrow, right? So we all are driven by something, right? And most of us have some monetary value associated with that something in most situations. I'm not going to say in all, but in most situations. So transformational leadership is, are you shaking your head or hand? Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say, I see this in nonprofits too. These are
You
the
do?
blue sky thinkers. You know, these are the ones that inspire you to intellectual conversations and so forth. And so forth. You would come in the next day. All right, we don't have pay now. We'll get paid next week. I'm still going to keep going.
Yep. That and next one, leadership side that we're going to talk about, which are charismatic leadership, they're very close in that. And what you're kind of touching in is a little bit more of the charismatic than it is than the transformational. But transformational says, hey, I'm seeing you do this work. I see you every day come into the office and you go check all of these different boxes off by walking around making sure everyone's got everything that they need so that they can proceed with their job, right? I see the example, right? I follow the example as well as me buying in, right, to ensure that I am growing within my career, right? Any questions on transformation? But you're absolutely correct. There are a lot of nonprofits that use this mentality and charismatic because, let's be honest, if you don't have pay, you want those staff still to come back. So they're dedicated to the role of doing it. What if I told you I represent a chapter that this is all we do? If you really consider it. We have nothing but volunteers. I am the president of the PMI Dallas chapter. You know what my check is? It will be the same even when I'm gone and when I'm here. 0. Right? So our chapter is an example of transformational leadership. We bring in people through the ranks, and we hope to train them up to take on that role so that when that individual may, for reasons unbeknownst to us, they may step outside and may get another job in another state, may get something else that comes up. You want them to be able to step into that role and to fulfill that responsibility, right? There's no pay associated with it. But guess what? There is a reward, and it's individualistic what that reward is. Volunteering, right? So there are a lot of companies, and shall I say the M word, millennials, that are buying into this thought, right? And this is driving a lot of people because they see the benefit for them, regardless of the reward associated with it. Have you thought about it that way? How many people volunteer? I can tell this is going to be a lot. Right? Just about everybody in the room is raising their hand. They volunteer in some aspect. Well, when you're volunteering, there is no pay. So what are you using? You say, oh, well, yes, I'm doing it for a better reward, and my reward may be later on in the afterlife or whatever. Okay, sure. Perfectly fine. There is no monetary exchange of funds. So you're doing this, you're giving back, right? And part of you, and if you disagree with this, please, by all means, add your thoughts to the train here as we keep going down the path. Part of it is you're giving back because you're seeing the benefit that is impacting others, and maybe someone gave into you, right? Reciprocity, right? So, any people who disagree with that mindset, that thought process? No one in the room wants to take the opposite opposite? I'm just kidding. All right, let's keep going so we can get to the fun stuff. I promise you we will be out of here by 8 o'clock. I'll promise you that. Charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership style really relies on the leader to have the charisma or the persuasiveness to move you forward by giving you conviction and commitment. Right? We just recently celebrated the birthday of a very good charismatic leader. Right? That's what he did. He used commitment and conviction to move the times forward. This is not new. If you go to a church, regardless of what kind of church you go to, more than likely, you're going to see someone that stands before you, and they're going to use the same approach. Right? Because they're pulling on the strings of the heart. That's what that charisma is. It's that connection. It's that internal connection to something greater than what you have today. Right? Now, you got to be very careful with this one. Because, and if you're a used car salesman, please don't be offended by this. That's the same approach that some used car salesmen may use when they're trying to get you to come in and purchase that vehicle. You know you want a new ride. You know you've got 120,000 miles on that car, right? It's time for you to get a new one. You're going to have the timing belt that needs to be replaced. You're going to have a lot of other features and sensors that are going to start going out on that vehicle. It's really time for you to get a new vehicle. Have you considered trading that one in? Never forget to trade in, right? Is there any car salesman in the room? I don't want to offend anyone. But I could probably be a relatively okay used car salesman from that perspective because I know those are the parts that they pull on, right? They're wanting to take something that you have to put you in something better than what you have today. Right? And they're going to give you conviction if you get ready to walk off the lot. What do you mean you're going to come back and see me tomorrow? No one ever comes back and sees me tomorrow. Why turn down today what you could why turn down today what you're going to have for tomorrow? You know the value of your car if you go out of here is probably going to devalue a little bit. And it won't be the same if we take that trade in tomorrow. Right? You can look at it as a positive or a negative. I'm not saying that. I'm just giving you the characteristics. Right? And all of us have hopefully all of us have some features associated with that. Because it will come a time where you have to have that charisma to inspire people to do something that you may not have the fiduciary responsibilities to pay them for. Right? They may not be one of your direct reports, but you need them to complete the project. They may not report to you, depending on your reporting structure. You may be in a matrix environment. They don't report to you, but you still need them to complete the project. You might want to pull out charisma and use a little bit of that, right? So I'm not saying this is a negative by any means leadership style. I'm just giving you characteristics of that leadership style that are familiar with. Hopefully most of us have purchased a vehicle at some point, because I don't think there's very many close light rails to here, right? I mean, there is one, but it's not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a little further down, right? So you had to get in some vehicle to come here, correct? So hopefully you've purchased a vehicle, and if you're not, let me not spoil the opportunity for you. Please go take upon the opportunity to see the used car salesman. Yes?
I can see, it definitely has a downside though.
It does.
Have you ever been in a group that has just a charismatic leader and that leader disappears, all of a sudden you got a power vacuum? Right?
That is
The whole
correct.
group's like, what do we do now? And you needed somebody who's also transformational at the same time to make you into other leaders, so when they leave, you don't have a power vacuum.
That is correct. You're absolutely correct. What she's saying is, with this leadership style, if the leader leaves, you get an instant, because that charisma is what kept everyone together. And they were all being supported off of the one person marching in front saying, hey, we got to get together and march down this aisle, right?
It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable?
Unless you implement some of the other styles with it.
Correct. Well,
Transformation.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's not sustainable, because a good charismatic leader is going to develop the follower that's going to replace them before they leave.
Well, wouldn't that then mean he's transformational? Like, Chris, I don't see.
yes, he does have some
him
transformational-
Him
yes.
developing his replacement doesn't, I don't see that as part of charisma. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Charismatic, I see that as now he's being a bit transformational, developing his replacement, so then you don't have that power.
I can see your point there. Yes, it could be very looked at from that perspective as well, where you're transitioning that authority and that kind of thing, yes. But once again,
It's very difficult to replicate charisma.
it's very difficult to recommend.
You really can't impart to others the way transformation happens.
Yes.
It's something very unique to the person.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And organizations that rely heavily on charisma, what you find is if once that leader's gone, they have to reinvent themselves.
They're not sharing with the group because they're just expecting that guy to do it all.
That's correct. They're expecting that guy to tell them what needs to happen next, right? In a sense of, it's got similar constructs, if you will, with autocratic in some sense. But I'm inspiring people, which is the driving factor, versus me just dictating to you and telling you, right? I'm giving you inspiration to do this said outcome or result that I'll be looking for. So, yes.
I know some leaders who use this style on some occasions, especially during initial sales when they're meeting a new customer. They use part of the charisma
Yep.
to be able to open the doors.
You-
Afterwards, you can change.
You absolutely need this when you're first going into a sales agreement. Let me be clear. You don't know anything about them other than their stats, and they don't know anything about you other than your stats. So you have to have something as an icebreaker, right? So this is very much important in that type of environment.
This is the Jack Welch style.
Jack Welch does have some key attributes associated kind of with this. And one could see some of the challenges with GE once he left, right? With that transition. Situational leadership. How many people have heard of situational leadership? Yes, just about the majority of people in the room. So I can just put this one up and we can good to go. No, I'm just kidding. Situational leadership says that I must adapt my leadership style to the development needs of my followers, right? So it says, me, as the leader, right, I have to adopt the way in which I communicate to those individuals so that I'm giving them the information based off of giving them delegation, supporting, coaching, or directing, right? Obviously, the spectrum actually goes, I don't know if you all can see over here, D1, D2, D3, D4, right? This is the development needs, meaning they're very high needs over here versus an individual who's not very high need there. Just need a lot of support, right? And it depends. This may change based on whatever you're reviewing. So it actually goes, if you're needy, I've got to give you more direction. If you're somewhat needy, but you're experienced, I can give you some coaching just to get you along the way. And then I get to a point where you're not as needy, but you're still, you've got some high sense over here for support, and I need to give you a little bit more through a supporting, just by saying, yes, come into my office, however so often you so feel, and let's just discuss this topic, right? That would be the supporting aspects. Coaching versus me sitting down with you, giving you one-on-one sessions, walking through some of the aspects to make sure before you go down that approach. And then obviously, if you're not needy, if you don't have a challenge with the developmental needs for whatever project that you may be doing, you may say, hey, I'm delegating this project to you. It's for you to go out and to do. So that's situational leadership in a nutshell. We good? We've talked a lot about this one, servant leadership. I should let you give the presentation for servant leadership. Servant leadership says exactly what it is. You are a servant's heart. You're interested in serving the people more than you are serving yourself. Okay? That's what it says. You're supportive, you ensure, you resolve, you verify, you inform, you contact, and you educate. That's what a servant leader is. Okay? Now we've discussed these 8 topics of leadership. Let's do a quick survey. How many of you have smart devices in the room? Smartphones, iPads, what have you connected? This is your opportunity where you get to take part into our survey. So, but you never heard this out of the platform. Pull out your smartphone. And let's start the survey. We've got 6 or 7 questions. The first one's a couple questions just to get a few demographics things so we can kind of see that everyone knows how to use their device before we really start talking about some of the specifics. If the internet connection's here, we'll make it work. Let's see. So you can either text or you can actually do the email. The email is pollev.com / going that way, Joe Carson 429, if you, not email, excuse me, the website. Or you can text, if you text Joe Carson 429 to 36707, 37607, then you can still give a response. So let's see if it works. Let me know when you sent your response. Trying something new. We'll see how well it works. If not, we'll do it new with the old-fashioned version. Just raise your hand. One person did it. We got at least 1 or 2 people. We got 2 responses. What's it saying? The women are faster at doing this than the men? I'm just kidding. Huh? Or the men aren't doing it? No, that's possible too. So is everyone who's interested in doing this already completed? I don't want to move to the next question until we all sure that we know how to move forward. Yes, no, maybe so. This is the interactive part where you at least have to nod your head and shake your head or something, so I at least know. Okay? So let's look at our next question. Not asking your age per se, I'm just getting some demographics once again. Someone's quick. Okay? And here, there's a reason why I'm doing this. I want to see where our thought processes are in alignment once we know this data. So everyone's seeing this data come in, and we can see where our thought processes are. It seems like the 50% of the people in the room, as it shows right now, well, it's changing. 50% of the people in the room are between the age of 30 and 49. Seems like we don't have any freshmen in the room, so it sounds like we're good to go. 18, 29, okay. All right. Everyone that's done this, good to go? All right. A couple more changes. Okay. So this is pulling live if you can't figure it out, right? As soon as you hit your response, it comes in and I see it up on the screen. Or we all see it on the screen. There's a reason why I'm putting this age in here. We'll just talk about it. One believes, or one may believe, depending on your age, it affects how your leadership styles are because of your historical references. Okay? So, let's see. All right, let's go to the next one. Are you a project manager? Yes, no, maybe so. I'm interested. Yes.
Answer to that question is if you have the title or do you do or a project?
Either or. Either or. Got a lot of project managers in the room. I would expect that at an applied PM forum, right? So we know we're talking to the right audience. We've got a few people who are not, but that's perfectly fine. Hopefully you gain something out of this discussion as well. If you had to use one word to describe a leader based on your experience, what would it be? One word to describe a leader based on your experience, what would it be? I don't know if you've ever seen this before. This is a wordle. So the word that's used more often actually will appear larger. Okay? Looks like we've got a couple of words up there. Change, confident, visionary, influencer, effective, successful, driven, caring, believer, trust, involved, confident, dynamic, driven. Everyone in here? Need to wait? Okay. So those are all interesting words. We won't go too much into detail with those, but we could consider that with our next question. What one characteristic do you believe a leader must have? Influential, vision, honest, listening, honesty, competence, listening, trust. Everyone done? Got your one word in? I want to take a moment to think about this. Everyone says here, these are characteristics that must be present, that you feel must be present in a leader. Okay? Consider those words: influential, listening, honesty, trust, vision, good, trustworthiness, trustworthiness, responsible, authentic, patient, decisive, driven. Those are good words to describe, hopefully, a lot of us in the room. I would ask you this: how many of us apply those same terms in our project management lives every day in what we do? Right? So this is your input, which you have provided as part of today's presentation. Right? So it's not just one person's view of what it takes to be an effective project manager in your career. These are your words, right? What you think that leader must have. Very good. Let's look at one more question here. It didn't. I'm not going to repeat that one. Not for the tape. No, I'm just kidding. If you had one word to describe an ethical leader based on your experience, what would it be? Now, someone may ask, why did I separate the difference between must-have in leadership and an ethical leader, right? We'll talk about that real quickly. How many people need more time? Integrity, honesty, true, fair, caring, transparent, admire, understanding, ethical, victory. Now let me ask you this. When I ask an ethical leader versus a must-have for a project leader, or a leader, I said a leader, right? Those words are not the same. Why? Have we thought about that? Why shouldn't they be the same?
Assumed that ethical was a part of it, so we didn't give it a special criteria.
Okay. But my point to you is they're not the same terms, right? We do have some of the same terms, but some of these terms are slightly different. And I'm not going to take upon time to maybe toss out any ideas, but I'm just going to ask you something to consider when you're thinking about it, right? Do you look at an ethical leader differently than you do someone that you say must have this technique to be a leader? Right? Something to consider. All right. Which of these leadership styles do you believe reflects your company's structure? They're in the same order in which I reviewed them. Autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire, transactional, transformational, charismatic, situational, and servant. Wow. Interesting data popping up on the screen, huh? How many people expected what they're seeing? So right now it shows that we've got, 13% autocratic, 13% democratic, 20% laissez-faire, 40% situational, 13% are servant leadership. Did everyone enter their response? Changed a little bit, 19, 8, 38, okay. Interesting. We don't have any charismatic leaders, or we feel that your company's charismatic leader, or you're transformational or transactional in the room. Anyone in manufacturing in the room? Anyone working a not-for-profit organization in the room? Interesting.
It's kind of hard to answer this one because you're looking at the overriding factor and what you sense or observe as an individual. Somebody else working for the exact same company may feel something else.
This is true. I'm asking your perception. I'm not necessarily, I agree with you.
It's not a single one.
Agree.
Because in some cases it may be one and in other cases it may be a different.
Yeah, I agree. So one way of wording that probably differently maybe would be the overarching review of the company, right? So I can agree with that statement. I can get on board with that. Okay? So we all know what a project is. I'm not going to take much of our time, but since we are project managers, I have to mention PMI's PMBOK, right? The new one that just came out. So we all know that the new PMBOK came out 2017. And the project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. One more question for you here, if it pops up. Okay. How do I apply the correct leadership style? Actually, this is the question I want you to answer first. Let's answer this question and then we'll come back to that slide. Had 2 slides in there. So this one is there a correct leadership style for your project situation and phase? Yes, no, I don't know. No clue. Joe just spent an hour and 23 minutes talking to me and I have no clue. Actually, more than that. 27 minutes talking to me and I have no clue. I like it. That had to be my wife. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I agree with you. So a lot of people say there's a correct leadership style, but to be frankly honest with you, there are multitude of factors that actually have to take into consideration when you're looking at leadership style, right? Power of influence, the project manager's, project sponsor's viewpoint, the client's viewpoint, the status of the project, if they're on target, not on target, on budget, not on budget, what have you. Power of communication. There are a lot of attributes that you've got to take in consideration, not just, you can't singly look at one aspect and say, oh yes, this is it, this is all it needs to have. This is the one leadership style. I agree with our statements from the beginning of our session tonight. We need to use all of these based on the situation in which our project is in. Okay? So, I'm not saying situational is the right answer because situational is saying that you're looking at the development needs only of your staff. Well, I may not only need to look at the development needs of my staff, that may be for that particular situation, but I might need to be charismatic. I might need to be transformational. I might need to be transactional. I'm saying you have to look at all of them, respectively, based on the premise from which you're reviewing it in the first place. Okay? So here are some of the expected results that I would expect you to see if you select using the correct leadership style, right, for your applicable projects. Better communication. Team will be more dedicated. Productive teams, completed projects. Okay? Teams are going to be inspired to complete the project successfully and timely. The improved project management leverage. Here's the key. If you as a project manager can tap into these different instances and different styles of leadership, you now have leverage to use that leadership style when you need to because you know about them. You can be charismatic. You can be transformational. You can be transactional. Right? You can be all of these different leadership styles, and there are many more. So what I suggest to you tonight at the end of my presentation is there's not one correct leadership style, right? All of them are correct leadership styles. Thank you, and have a good night. And I do, if you want a copy of the presentation, please send me your information or give me your information.
Thank you very much, Joe.
And I've got some treats for you up here as well.
We got a little gifty for you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renee. Transactional.